Okay, you guys, welcome to part two. So in part one, we talked about some of the technological innovations brought by the market revolution. We discussed the railroad, we discussed the telegraph, as well as roads and steamboats, and the cotton gin. And we discussed how the cotton gin revolutionized American slavery. But were these the only people, the only groups? Who else was brought into the market revolution? Well, really everyone. Even commercial farmers are brought into the market revolution. Now farmers are able to concentrate on growing crops and raising livestock for sale as opposed to growing crops and raising livestock for themselves. Now that we have innovations in transportation, you're able to put your goods on the back of a steamboat or on the back of a railroad, and you're able to sell it throughout the United States. Now that we have these innovations in technology, we're able to become, I would say, people who are a bit more commercial. People will begin now to purchase goods from stores instead of having to make the goods themselves because we're getting the development of brands. At this time, we get, as far as I would say, farming brands. We do get some farming brands during the market revolution. We get John Deere. John Deere invented the steel plow in 1837, and by the 1850s, it's being mass produced. And there's also Cyrus McCormick. Cyrus McCormick invented the reaper in 1831, which increased the amount of wheat that a farmer could harvest at any one time. It's also during the market revolution, one thing I said in part one, hopefully, is that the United States as a whole experiences a lot of changes. It becomes less agrarian. It becomes less agricultural, and I would say more commercial. So even farmers at this time are becoming more commercial because they're able to focus on growing livestock or growing crops and raising livestock for an economic purpose instead of strictly like survival. It's also during this time that we get the growth of cities. Less and less people are going to live in the countryside. America becomes a bit less agrarian. It becomes, I would say, it moves a little further from that ideal that some of our founders, such as Thomas Jefferson, had of this agrarian country where everyone is able to have a piece of land for themselves and it's a country of independent farmers. We really move away from that during the market revolution, and urban centers will witness dramatic changes. Entrepreneurs, for example, will begin to gather artisans and workers into large workshops in order to oversee their work and subdivide their tasks. What does that sound like? I'll repeat it. Entrepreneurs or bosses will begin to gather artisans and other workers into large workshops in order to oversee their work and subdivide their tasks. What does that sound like? Now, if you said, that sounds like a factory, you would be correct. It's during this time in American history, during the market revolution, that we get the factory system. America's first factory was established by Samuel Slater in 1790 in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And during this time, they have something called the outwork system, where rural men and women would earn money by taking jobs in factories. That's the outwork system. Pretty simple, right? You're taking jobs in the factories, which are normally located in the cities, but during this time, I would say the earliest factories are located near fall lines. A fall line is where waterfalls and or river rapids can be harnessed to provide power for a lot of the spinning and weaving machinery. So they would locate these factories near rapids or near waterfalls so they could use the water to power a lot of their machinery. The early industrial revolution, again, was largely confined to New England, and these factories, for the most part, produced cotton textiles. So the desire for cotton, the early industrial revolution in creating or producing cotton textiles will generate this huge demand for cotton. And Eli Whitney, in a way, answers this demand in 1793 by making cotton a lot easier to clean and harvest. And so you see how the North and South kind of feed off of each other. The southern part of the United States is providing the labor and the raw material needed to fund this industrial revolution that's happening in the North. So in the North, they'll develop factories, but in the South, you don't get a lot of factory growth. You don't get this technological growth. You don't get factories in the South because in the South, they had human factories known as enslaved people. Factories gathered large groups of workers under the supervision of like a single central supervisor, and they replaced hand tools with power-driven machinery at some point. By the 1840s, steam power made it possible to where factory owners could locate their factories into town, in town. You don't have to necessarily be near the fall line. Okay, now early industrial workers really are women. But before we get into this, let's talk about how the Industrial Revolution and how the market revolution really revolutionizes Americans' conception of time. And you're probably thinking, what time? Time seems to be so concrete. But before people were really working in factories, when they were working on the farm, their life was regulated by the seasons, right? There is a time to harvest, or there's a time to reap, and there's a time to sow. There's a time to plant, there's a time to harvest. But in the cities, the clocks really dominate life. On the farm, you work as long as the sun is up. And when the sun goes down, you are no longer working. However, in the cities, your clocks really will dominate life. Pay will change and become a wage. And so the New England textile mills at this time will really rely pretty heavily on the work will rely on female and child labor. So please put this in your notes. At this time in 19th century America, there are no child labor laws. There are no overtime laws. There are no laws that say you have to get paid a certain amount of money. Workers don't have any workplace protections. It simply does not exist during this time. So a lot of these New England textile mills relied very heavily on female and child labor. And a lot of the women who worked in these factories were young, unmarried women. They are going to be the ones that really dominate the workforce. Your book refers to a subset of women as mill girls. And what were mill girls? Mill girls were young women who were usually from rural areas, and they would come to the city or come to the textile mill to work. And in order for a lot of the times, these young women would leave home and they would stay in boarding houses owned by the factory. So in order to persuade parents to allow their young daughters to leave home and to work in these mills, a lot of the owners would set up boarding houses where they would have really strict rules regulating their personal behavior, saying that you had to go to church and you might have a curfew, just to ensure that young women who were new to these cities weren't put in any sort of social or moral danger. And so a lot of these factories, again, would have boarding houses that were owned by the factory worker or by the factory owner. So workers would be there so they wouldn't have to commute. But again, a lot of these were young women. And by young women, I'm saying like teenagers, 16, 17, 14, 15, and even younger. Because again, there are no child labor laws during this time. Okay? So please read up on mill girls in your text, look through the PowerPoint, and we will continue in part 3 with the growth of immigration and the rise of nativism.